Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. A while ago, like my 5 or 6 years now, I wrote an article about how to blend seamlessly cutouts into your image. And while this is a very important topic, there's one topic that seems to be completely disregarded, even though many people did more videos on that topic, is the more broader question and actually more important question of where the hell do I actually place cutouts in the first place? So in this video, I want to touch on more like composition principles that will sort of like help you understanding where you should place people in your image, like more general concepts and things to keep in mind, things to never do because they're really bad ideas, and basically understanding a little bit better the overall tensions and principles that come into play when you start placing cutouts in your image. So yeah, let's get started. So here's the scene we're going to use in order to show some of the concepts that I think are very important when it comes to placing people in your image. Don't pay too much attention on like how the cutouts are actually integrated, because this is not the actual subject. What I want to talk about is more like the way you place them in your image, because there's a lot of misunderstanding on how you should do it, or like what is the actual impact of what happens. And what I want you to understand from this video, or at least a little, is how you can better place people in order to build up the composition rather than ruin it, and also to understand what's the actual consequence of placing people in a certain area or not, so that when sometimes you have a client asking you, can we put like people smiling in the foreground, then you can explain them by A plus B why it's a bad idea, what it's going to change in the perception of the overall image, and why then it's actually not fitting what they're actually trying to create in terms of effect. So generally speaking, people are among the elements in an image that has the most heavy weight, or the heaviest weight. The first and foremost is usually shapes and lights or values. So this is why your eyes are going to be drawn to this image, or to this part of the image, sorry. For that, you can check again the video I did on the color, like burn and dodge tool, because this is a bit about like what we call greatest area of contrast, and like stuff regarding Gestalt theory and like figure-ground relationship, etc. Here, in our case, a couple of things that is important to understand is that people have different weight depending on how many they are, where they're facing, and then also the values and colors they have. But for instance, if I put just this woman here, she's going to have a completely different weight in your image than if I put this one here. The reason is pretty simple, is that a single person, when you can see their face, they actually have, because your eyes are drawn to faces. This is like a completely human behavior that you just can't bypass. So it means that anytime you're going to see a face very close to your like camera, instead of going to look at this project here, you're going to first look at the face that you can recognize. So this is something to really keep in mind. Another thing that is going to happen is that if you use something that is going to, like someone that is going to look back, on the other hand, is that you're going to still look at the person, because you're looking for what we call aspective view, which is like the fact that you can recognize human just by their silhouettes. And then you're going to sort of infer what she or he is doing. And in our case here, she seems to be looking in that direction. So this could be maybe something that is interesting to say, I want to point in that direction, but I'll come later to that topic. But still, in terms of weight, there's a completely different dynamic. If I have someone facing, I'm going to look at the actual person and look at the person, especially if there's like text on her or on the cutout in general. But if it's someone looking like the back of someone and I can't really analyze much, it means that I'm still going to be attracted to that area, but then I'm going to either analyze what's he or she is doing, so where it's looking, or just go back or go forward to the next areas of interest that I have in my brain. There's also an interesting contrast that exists between singular people and groups. It sort of behaves, it's kind of a dynamic that you need to understand is that if you only have a single person somewhere, it's going to attract more than, say, a group of people. This is a bit counterintuitive, but for instance, when it comes to groups, if I have a crowd here, but it's like mostly looking back, it won't have much of a weight in my image. But if I have a crowd in the front like this, they're going to have quite a weight in my image because it's several faces that I am going to be drawn to. But if, for instance, I mix both and have like this crowd here of like people going away, so it's like just sort of shades or silhouettes that are very simple, and I mix it with like a girl somewhere or even like a girl crossing here the street, I'm going to have a sort of interesting contrast created between the heavy part here and the less heavy part here. And like a singular person, is going to actually catch more attention than a group of people. This has to do as well with like the value here, because we're always attracted to brighter values or like greatest area of contrast. But still, there's this sort of thing that if I have a group of people and a singular people, I'm creating a sort of tension between those two entities, and I'm going to navigate between the two and sort of find interest in both areas. Another thing that is important to understand regarding crowds as well, or even singular people, is that what happens is if I put like a crowd here, there's something quite interesting that happens, is that the crowd basically, if there's nothing to contrast with it, if there's something to contrast with it, so here you have an empty street and here suddenly you have people. So you're going to have this sort of contrast between these two areas that is going to draw your eye and contrast it to here, and you're going to be, oh, this is empty here, there's people here, so there's something happening. What is interesting though is that depending on what's like the type of, let's say, shapes that you have here, if it's like people looking towards us or people looking away or whatever, you're going to have a different behavior. You can either just have this sort of element here that becomes an anchor point and then you look at the rest of the image. Or if there's too much and too many things happening and too many things catching your attention, what is going to actually happen is that you're going to look at this and start looking at it in details, which is actually not something you really want. But the fact that is interesting is that crowds in general have a weight in the image, but they don't catch your attention in the sense that they don't retain your attention. So if you want to anchor something, you can have like a crowd is actually, if a crowd makes sense because you want stuff to happen here, you can actually have a crowd that catches your eye to that part of the image, and then it will quickly be uninteresting for your eye and you will start looking at the rest of the image. It is a little bit different with singular people, or I don't know if it's a grammatical way of saying that, but like if I have just a single person here, it is a little bit different because we're like more emphasizing this like by contrast on this the rest of the element here, or like the rest of the architecture, and we're going to analyze a little bit deeper what the person is doing because the aspect of view is more legible, so we can see that she's walking, we can see like understand where she's walking, etc. So there's like a lot more information, and it does have quite a bit of weight. So if I were to compare or like combine, this elements of like a crowd on one side and just a single person here, you would start creating an interesting dynamic between the two. So these are like general consideration on the people in general. Now we can have a look at like this idea of like what you can do with people. What is interesting is that there's two aspects that you can have. The first one is you can sort of convey information regarding the context of your image, and you can convey information regarding your own project. So what it means is that you can start creating, for instance, in my overall animation here, you can start creating some sort of small scenarios of people using the context. So using the sidewalk, using the crossing space, etc. And the good thing, or rather the thing, is that you can start giving a sense of flows and a sense of massing. So like if you start putting people that sort of accumulate in certain areas, then we will understand there's like a plaza. Or if you put it in more like people walking all the time. You have more this idea of like flows and like a busy street, etc. So this is something to keep in mind on how you can convey information about the neighborhood, etc. Still keeping in mind what I just said before is that these are going to catch quite a bit of attention, but the fact that they're, for instance, looking like walking one direction and being more like the back is looking at us, it means that they're not going to catch too much attention, and we're going to retain just this information and still be looking at the project. If we had like a lot of people looking all in our direction here, for instance, they would catch a lot of attention, and we would not even pay much more attention to these guys, or at least like the sort of delay would be much longer, because we would be more analyzing like what's happening here. Are they like waiting to cross or something like that? The other thing that you can do with people is to show the architecture use, or like the project use, which is quite interesting as well, of course. So you can have like silhouettes in your building, etc. You can sort of, depending on this distance you are from your project, you can show more or less details. You can have like people having really specific activities using the project. You can show actually by having like single people again or against groups, you can show where are the part in the project where people accumulate and gather, whereas the part where they want to be like more alone, or like going from one place to another in like a sort of transition space. So these are things you can show with people that you can't really show with anything else. Of course, the always thing to keep in mind in terms of balance is that you generally don't want to give the idea of something being too busy, because then you can't read the space. Regarding this idea of not being able to read the space, one thing that I wanted to mention quite quickly, but that is very important, it's not the best example here, but there's this idea when you place people that there are some areas where you shouldn't put them. There are several options that you shouldn't do. The first one is that you don't want people to, I'll just put all of them to express my ideas. You don't want people to cover too much your image, basically, especially when it's like, how can I say? Except if you're really looking for like a specific effect. Usually it's really like a bad way of doing things to cover like huge part of your image. If you had like someone with his head like this covering the building, and you only had this and you're covering the entrance. The overall thing to remember is that you don't want people to cover a very specific space like the entrance. If they cover the entrance, you want, like when you add people, you want that you say like I want them to enter the space. What you want is to still keep the entrance legible. It's the same with what we would call like structural elements, or even like composition lines or structural lines, is that you don't want to have people aligning with those lines, because suddenly your brain is going to create some sort of like imaginary lines. And what happens is that if someone like a cutout or a car or whatever aligns with that line, it suddenly gets way more weight than it should. And this is a very interesting dynamic. It means that, like, for instance, those cars are not really well placed, because here you have a very strong edge that is very important because it's on the corner of the building. And what happens is that instead of ending nicely and being able to read the geometry of the building, we end on this really shitty car that sort of catches your attention so much, even though it's a completely trivial element in the image. So this is something to always keep in mind, is that you don't want, every time you place an element, you don't want to put it in very structural and important lines. So for instance, instead of putting someone here or here, you would put them in the middle, or like not perfectly in the middle, but maybe slightly offsetted or stuff like that. One thing that I mentioned also is regarding the foreground. So as I was saying, depending on what people are doing in the foreground, they're going to have a completely different weight. So that woman here reading the time is actually, with like text, is actually catching a lot of attention. If we change it for this one, it's actually a little bit better because it's not catching too much attention. It's sort of like pointing it back to something here. Or if we have like something a little bit more but less subtle, where you have someone taking a photo even though she seemed to be taking a selfie or whatever, but it sort of looked like something that is like stretching out and sort of directing your eye. But still, I personally am against kind of having people in the foreground to a certain extent, because it generally means, it generally doesn't bring anything to the image. Because what you should end up with is like people looking back. So it could be like looking inside the image. So it could be interesting, but the thing is that if you want them to look back or look into the image, then you're going to have them quite close to your like camera, and they're going to cover so much potential information that this can be quite problematic to read the image. One big no-no as well is, as I was saying, but slightly differently, is you don't want your cutout to cover something very important. For instance, if I had this woman covering almost with her arms most of the crossing path here, this would be a big problem, because suddenly we don't understand what's happening or what can be done in this space. Sometimes you also don't want to cover areas that are like in the back, like point of perspective or like exit points in your composition. Because if you cover this, then suddenly all your converging lines are going to like a single person, and then it actually gets suddenly a lot of weight in your image, instead of being completely, even though it's like completely irrelevant in the composition, like that person. It's something to keep in mind. One thing also that is very awkward and that we find most of the time is people pointing at stuff as if it was something very subtle. So this is something I think you can sort of do it if you do it like on someone very tiny somewhere, so that you kind of have like not someone pointing in your face something that you're supposed to look at. Because and that's the thing, in terms of composition, if you need someone in your image to point at where you're supposed to look in your image, it means that your image is not properly composed. Here, for instance, we already have most of our greatest area of contrast happening here. We have like a lot of emphasis in light and framing that sort of shows that this is where you're supposed to look. So I don't need to add that guy pointing at the building, because I know this is where I'm supposed to look. So be careful not to fall for that sort of very weird solution to problems. Like if you feel like there's an area that is not giving or like not getting enough attention, it's actually easier, as I said earlier, to maybe have like people gathering or a single person here that sort of catch your attention, rather than having someone in the foreground pointing it like in that direction, because it really takes the viewer for someone stupid, and it really undermines the quality of what you should be able to come up with in terms of composition. I think I'm almost done with everything. There are like probably other aspects that I haven't covered. One thing that as I was saying earlier, is that it really depends also on the value. If you have like a lot of people here and like someone in the sun here, this person is going to catch more attention than this person, because we're always attracted to brighter values, generally speaking, or at least the greatest area of contrast. One thing though, that is a very general comment regarding composition, is that everything is sort of like can be balanced. So there's like a quote by John Ruskin that I quite like, where he basically says that every time, well, he's talking about colors in that case, but basically if I sort of paraphrase it, it says every time you add something in a composition, in an image, the whole composition is changing and its balance is changing. And this is really like true, because what it means is that every time I add something, there's new tensions created around that element that sort of relate to the other tensions that were existing in my image at first. So I have like tensions between those two trees. If I start adding people here, I'm creating new tensions, etc. And what it means is that you have to be very aware of like what type of tensions you're creating when you add like a crowd here, or when I add like a single person pointing somewhere here, or if I add like people walking in that direction or in that other direction, because there's a lot of things happening. I didn't mention that, but this is, I should, like, people walking in one direction is actually creating a sort of vector intention that leads your eye towards that element. If you're pointing or walking the other direction, you're actually creating tension toward the other end. So if, for instance, I have people here on the edge of my image, I have a lot of tension created here. But if they're walking that direction, it's even worse. Whereas if they're walking inside the image, it sort of release the tension here and sort of create more tension in that area. So then it means that I'm going to look more here rather than on the edge here. Another thing that I didn't mention is the scale. That is a very simple one, but that is interesting, is that by just using people, you can actually give a sense of scale. So this is okay in this sort of like image, but sometimes the space is a little bit more abstract and you actually need someone and like a human figure to anchor the sense of scale in the image. One thing also that is quite fun is that if you look at the work of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, he used to make his people slightly smaller than they should be in real life, which would make the building look a little bit bigger than it should be. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamic that are in play when you sort of start placing people. So really don't do it randomly. So that's it for the broad principles on like how to place people in your image. I hope you found this interesting and that those guidelines will stay in your mind next time you work on an image, and that you won't end up doing like placing people completely randomly in your image, but have like these guidelines in mind, because I really want to emphasize this, is that you can have the best image, but if you start placing people randomly, you can completely ruin the dynamic and the sort of composition overall of your image. Speaking of composition, I'm running a masterclass on that very topic that sort of helps you understanding the actual depth of that topic and how to make it actionable, and how to sort of use all that knowledge and put it into business practice by convincing your client to sort of follow your instinct and your sort of creative direction. So if you're interested by that topic, just follow the link in the description and maybe you'll join the next cohort. That will be it for now. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you found it interesting and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers guys, bye.